Yeah, I think one of the points of comparison, I love Zambia. I think I'm very proud of being Zambian. Um, and, in a lot of ways, had I had the choice and had the opportunities been there, we probably would have never left. But the reality is that there were certain barriers within the country that meant that my education would not have been recognized in the way that it is now. Having been trained in a Western country, having a degree from the West means I can choose to live anywhere in the world and work
Yeah.
because my qualifications will be recognized, which was a barrier. And my parents, like my grandparents with my mom, they perceived that they're like, well, in the future, we want our kids to have access to anything that they want in the world, any place. Um, so I think that was one of the biggest reasons my mom decided to move, was thinking about us going to university and um, where would that be able to take us
Mm.
in the future. And also there's political issues that meant that for example, my cousins in Zambia, to do a 3-year degree might take them 5 years because there's teachers lecturer strikes that happen. Um,
Ah,
so it like even when you can do the studies, there's issues in infrastructure around
inconvenient.
how
Yeah.
education
Yeah.
happens.
Correct.
um and yeah, I talked to my cousins back home, and I studied for 7 years. I've done my double degree psych criminology, did a master's in community psych, then trained as a clinical psychologist. Obviously, some I love studying, but I've never had have stops in that um, I was able to do that in 7 years, which is
Right.
because there was the luxury of not ever having to think about teachers striking for 3 to 6 months and losing an entire term. So that's the privilege that we have in the West when we study. I think sometimes we forget that there's structural,
Mm.
institutional issues with infrastructural issues back home. Um,
As
yeah,
yeah, obstacles. Correct. You're right.
yeah,
Absolutely.
and also just
So
that recognition. Yeah.
recognition as well, yes, we get worldwide recognition in having in these countries, so, and that's the most beautiful part. As you said, you can move anywhere, your degree is recognized, and there is no barrier basically, and you become barrier free. So amazing. And that's, so what about studying, like when you have done your bachelor's and master's both in New Zealand, right?
Yes.
All right. So while studying as a migrant, okay, let's talk about a migration journey. So
Yes.
as a migrant, have you seen any differences back home and in New Zealand or in UK when you're studying anything that is different that you've been taught or been trained for, and when you go to school, university specifically, then it's like, oh, stop, this is not matching with me.
Yeah, so I guess I can talk. Both my parents have done their masters after post migration. My
Wow.
dad did his masters in the UK, um, and at very specific experience of that. And then my mom did her masters in New Zealand.
All
Um,
right.
so I can kind of speak to the differences of experience. I think one was that um, it was the accessibility again, because yeah, my parents were able to work and do their masters part time. I did mine full time because I could,
Mhm.
because I was living at
Yeah.
home with mom.
Yeah.
Um, but I guess in terms of the education system, there some of there's a trade off when you choose to migrate. Some of the things that I found challenging was that my narrative, my experience of the world, wasn't often reflected in the um, what's the word, curriculum,
Right.
um, which, as a minority within a minority in the country that I lived in, was made sense. But I think I had to do some additional work for myself to be able to put myself in the stories I was learning, in the practices and the ways that I was being taught to do the work. So one of
Mm.
the jokes that I say is that I think oftentimes when I went to uni, it felt like the assumption was that I was white and all the people that I was going to work with as clients were going to be white. And when that's not the reality, you're having to do some additional work to be like, okay, so I'm not white. So that means this for me. Um, which was difficult, to an extent, but I love the fact that these things can be strengths, right? So while in studying, I was doing additional studying to translate culturally the information I was learning for it to make sense within my cultural experience, which means
Wow.
by the time I got out of my degree and did my master's and all that, I had done a lot of cultural translation, which we all do. We all kind of, when we're migrating and we're learning in institutions that are not from our home countries or home cultures, we automatically are translating the information for, if I was to explain this to my mom, or if I was to go home, what would this look like? How can I transmute this information to people who are still back home or other
Yeah.
diaspora folk? We do that work, which is why I think we make great employees, because we have done a lot of thinking.
Excellent.
So that translation, cultural translation work is something that I think most migrants have to do. And also in the workplace, you do the cultural translation of existing within that world and then the world that that exists at home. Because I lived in my parents' house, it was Zambia. We're in Zambia. When you come home, this is Zambia. When you go out
Zambia,
there, it's the rest of the world. But in home, yeah. So
it's Zambia, right? Great.
yeah.
And